So originally I was going to make this video about different mining techniques, what Y level you should mine at, and generally just optimizing the ability to mine specifically for diamonds. And then Mojang had to go and change everything by announcing 1.18 and what was 1.17 at the time. Not to mention that there are all kinds of exploits that have been found for finding diamonds in alternate ways. So here we are, and diamond mining kind of sucks now. So there are several key factors that changed in 1.18 that affect where you can find diamonds and how you're going to mine them. One of the key factors is that diamonds are now mostly found in deep slate compared to stone. And that is a bit of a challenge because deep slate does take longer to mine. There are also quite a few changes, obviously, to the cave generation. Caves are much larger. There are different shapes and sizes now, and that could, in theory, impact how we're going to find them. And also, obviously, the ore distribution has changed. So different ores are going to be more optimally found at different places, and diamond is no exception to that. But they did also add an additional rule or limitation to that, and it's that factor called reduced air exposure. So the idea is that they want to hide more of the diamonds and different ores depending on whether or not they're going to be directly exposed to air. This is in theory to compensate for the larger cave sizes, but we'll take a look and see how that actually impacts what we're going to be finding when we are doing some mining. Now, one thing I could do is just open up a new world, start mining around, write down some findings, but it would be fairly inefficient to do that as diamonds are fairly rare. So instead, I've written a custom data pack to automate the process and make it a bit more scientific. This data pack is very simple. It's just going to do a few different measurements at any given Y level, specifically between minus Y equals 64 all the way to Y equals 16, which is where we can find diamonds. It's just going to count them. How many total diamond ore are there? But also, it's going to look at the number of diamonds that are explicitly exposed to things like air and water. So the idea is that looking in a world like this here, we have this diamond ore that is directly exposed to air, and I can count that towards my total. But in theory, if you're finding this one diamond here, you're probably going to mine and find more of them behind that one there. So when I'm counting the total number of ores exposed to water or air, I'm also looking at all the ones that are directly connected to it, because you're probably going to find the one and then the others at the same time. So what this data pack is going to do is repeatedly scan blocks across very large distances in order to collect a large number of samples. So I'm roughly going to do around 5,000 blocks traversed. And in total, this is going to amount to somewhere between 7 to 12 million blocks checked. So I'm going to check a multitude of blocks as I traverse part of a world with the data pack. So let's run that data pack. And with all of that done, we can look at some results of what the data pack has found. And this is going to be shown in a few different graphs. So this graph here represents the number of diamonds found at any given Y level. So if we look at the horizontal axis here, this represents the Y level, or the depth in the world, going all the way from minus 64 all the way to Y equals 16. And then the vertical axis going upwards here represents the average number of diamonds found. Now note that the peak in this case is around this area here, sitting around 0.15%. So the likelihood of finding diamonds is still fairly rare, which is why we need a lot of samples. But we can see with this graph how it compares with the old version 1.17 versus the new one. So the green graph on the right-hand side here represents the previous version of the game, the 1.17, which is why it ends at Y equals 0. And then the purple graph obviously representing 1.18. So what we can see is that the previous version had a fairly flat distribution, as we expected. It peaked at around Y equals 7 to 11, around there. Whereas the current version doesn't really have a peak except at the very tip over here. But if we were to extend the old version and go all the way across over here, we can determine that the rate at which is going to be about the same, the equivalency point, is sitting at around y equals minus 44 to 48, somewhere around there. So if you're mining at that level, in theory, you should be finding diamonds at around the same rate, although there is a bit of an exception to that rule, and I'll explain that in a bit. And if we compare this to the estimates that Mojang are giving us, so they have provided us a very handy graph here to show where we should be finding which ores and what kind. Now, I'm not going to go through each one individually, as diamonds are my focus, but if I look at the old version, the 1.17 rate, which is this little rectangle here, this is going to tell me that it's a fairly flat distribution, and it goes all the way from 0 to 16, whereas if I now look at the new version, which is this triangle here, this lines up pretty much perfectly with the results that we had in the previous graph. So it does have that nice triangle shape. And also, if we look at the thickness of this rectangle here, it is roughly equivalent to the thickness at this point, which is around minus 48 in terms of its depth. So the measurements that I have made do seem to line up with the final version of this chart that Mojang has released for us. Things get a little more interesting, though, when we actually start looking at the exposure rates. So this one here is for specifically how many ores are exposed to air. And again, the 1.17 rates versus the 1.18 rates are here. And we can see that there is actually a very significant reduction in the number of diamonds. Do note there is actually a bit of a dotted outline around each graph. And this is to represent an error margin. You can't really see it on the previous one because it's so small, but there is a bit of a larger error range because there is a lot more of a rarity when it comes to diamonds actually being exposed to air. But regardless, we can see that the reduction is fairly significant. So that whole reduced air exposure factor does play in a fairly significant part. From my estimates, it's around an 80% reduction. So only 20% of the diamonds that could be exposed to air are actually going to be. Again, apparently this is supposed to be compensating for the fact that caves are much larger and they go much deeper. That remains to be seen, and it's a bit hard to calculate that. So I'd like to think they did this with good intentions, but it does seem a bit disappointing to me. Now, if we look at the rates for water by comparison, it has a bit of a different shape. It's actually quite interesting, really, because overall it does have this arching curve in terms of where you would find the blocks exposed to water. But there is that sort of dip right in the middle here, and I don't really have a good reason for this. It's possible that there are just fewer pockets of water between around y equals 0 all the way to y equals minus 20. I don't really know for sure. It's possible maybe we could do some more testing to figure that out. But regardless, it does have a bit of a nicer slope in terms of where you can find these different diamonds that are actually in water. And do note as well that at the very bottom, there isn't really anything here, as that's now trading it with where lava is going to be generating instead. What's a bit more interesting, though, is when we actually overlay the air versus the water results. Now, my immediate impression was that because reduced air exposure does not affect water, I was expecting the water rates to be significantly higher. But we can see that that's only really the case for this upper portion here. So anywhere around y equals 0, maybe minus 2 around there, you're going to find diamonds more frequently in water versus air. Now the rate's still fairly low, and it does actually sort of swap after this point. So now here, air is the dominating portion, where water is the one that's underneath it. So we do have, again, that really weird dip that's in the middle. And it is possible that the rate is lower for water just because there's less places where water is generating. I don't really know that for sure. But if you are concerned thinking, oh, should I go explore this cave or should I go diving instead? Odds are, based on the results I'm looking at, you're probably going to get about the same results either way. These numbers are very, very small regardless. So, it shouldn't really too much matter which way, you decide to go. Now, looking at all of these numbers and those graphs, I can't help but wonder how effective are the mining techniques that we used to use. Does branch mining still make sense? Does insta mining still work? At what Y level should we be mining? And the other thing that is a fairly big factor is mining stone versus mining deep slate. Does it still make sense to do one versus the other? And in order to measure these different techniques, I need some kind of metric in order to compare them. So I have gone with the ticks per diamond. So in other words, how many game ticks have passed per diamond that I would find. And just for reference, a game tick refers to a 1/20th of a second. So 20 in-game ticks is 1 real-world second. And because I'm measuring it in ticks per diamond, so for example, every 1,000 ticks, I find 1 diamond. That means that the higher the TPD, or ticks per diamond rate, the slower the actual rate of finding diamonds is. So if I say I'm finding diamonds every 1,000 ticks, and then I say, well, actually I'm finding it every 2,000 ticks, the 2,000 is going to be slower than the 1,000. So just bear in mind with that. Now, I am also going to emphasize that these are very rough estimates. These are not, you can say exactly how quickly you're going to find diamonds. These are just to compare the different techniques, so don't take them at face value. So the first technique that I'm looking at is regular branch mining, and this is just in 1.18, so branch mining with a pickaxe, no enchantments on it, fairly straightforward. And I want to compare what it's like for stone versus with deep slate. So does it still make sense to mine at a higher level because it's faster? And the more optimal position, from what I can tell, is at y equals 8. And that's just because if you go any lower, you'll start encountering deep slate. So back in my world here, I am actually sitting at y equals 8. So we can see that I do actually have some deep slate that is popping up on the ground here. And if I was to start branch mining directly here, we can see that I can just mine through stone fairly quickly. Whereas if I was to mine through deep slate, it is going to take longer to mine. So that's where that theory of, well, maybe it could be faster to find diamonds if I just continue to mine in stone in comparison with mining deep slate. So at that y equals 8 level, we can see that I get around a 26,000 TPD rate, which, remember, higher is slower. And if I even go down to y equals 0 in deep slate, which, remember, we're mining more slowly, I do still get a more efficient rate. So anywhere between that 19,000 to 14,000 with a netherite pick versus an iron pick. So this essentially means that even if I am mining more quickly in stone, I'm finding diamonds less frequently. So as long as you're going below y equals 0, you're really not going to be wasting your time compared to just doing it in stone directly. Now, the other technique that we're looking at is the insta-mining technique. And for those unfamiliar with insta-mining, the idea is that you're going to be setting up a nice big pyramid like this with a beacon on top. And in the beacon, you're going to be selecting haste 2, which will increase your mining speed as well. And the other requirement is that you need an enchantment of efficiency 5 on your pickaxe, either a diamond or netherite pick. And once that's all set up, you can essentially mine through stone blocks very, very quickly. It removes the cooldown after breaking each block. Whereas if I was to mine deep slate by comparison, even though I have that faster mining speed, it is not nearly as fast as just mining stone. So that's where insta mining could be more useful, but you can only do it in stone. So much like the previous one, I'm guessing this will be optimal at y equals 7 instead of 8, just because there are only a few deep slate blocks at the surface, so you can probably just ignore those. And this is actually going to be way faster than the previous result. So this is going to be roughly a 7,000 TPD rate as opposed to factors more. So it is fairly quick there. And if I was to try and aim for something even faster than that, something like this 7.2, I can actually achieve that just by going a little deeper in the deep slate. So with an iron pick, I'd have to go down to y equals minus 24. And with a netherite pick, I'd have to go down just to y equals 16. And this is with no enchantments on the pick. So even if I am insta-mining stone at that y equals 7 level, it's still less efficient than just going a bit deeper in the world to mine a regular branch mine. Now, one of the other things I was wondering is, how does this compare to 1.17? So insta mining, as I've already determined, doesn't really make sense to do in 1.18 since you can just go deeper and branch mine. But it does overall feel like mining diamonds is a bit slower. And just for comparison, that 7200 TPD I was talking about on the previous page, That's roughly 1 diamond ore found every 6 minutes. So that's really not all that fast. But again, we're not going as deep as we could, so maybe we could actually get faster speeds than that. So if we were to compare 1.17 to 1.18 with regular branch mining and no enchantments on our pickaxe, in 1.17 the more optimal height would be y equals 8 once again. And this is going to give us around 2,000 to 3,000 TPD, which is still fairly quick. And if I was to try and achieve a similar speed in 1.18, I'd have to go to the bottom of the world, which is minus 58. And even then we can see I'm not reaching it. This is anywhere between 2 to 3,000, 3 to 4,000 even rate. I cannot get quite as fast with mining diamonds. So unfortunately, even though there are more places you can mine diamonds, because Deep Slate is harder to mine, it takes longer. With an unenchanted pickaxe, you just can't get the same result with branch mining. This story does, however, change when we do look at using an efficiency 5 pickaxe instead of no enchantments on it whatsoever. And do note that once you reach that level of efficiency 5, it really doesn't matter what type of pickaxe you're using, whether it be iron, diamond, or netherite. You're breaking blocks at basically the same rate anyways, so that TPD is going to be about the same. So again, with 1.17 at that y equals 8 level, we're reaching 1600 TPD. And if I want to achieve the same speed in 1.18, at y equals 54, which is not the bottom of the world at this point, we're getting the same speed. So there is actually a small buffer at the very bottom of the world between 54 to 58 in the negative, where we could get a faster branch mining speed than in 1.17. So we can at least get that once we are looking at enchanting our pick. Unfortunately, we cannot say the same thing for insta mining. So as I said before, insta mining means efficiency 5 and haste 2. And if I was to branch mine in 1.18 with that, I am getting at the most optimal between 13 to 1400 TPD, and that's nowhere nearly as close as the 700 rate that you would get in 1.17. So unfortunately, we cannot come close to that insta mining speed that we could previously get. And I suspect this is probably done in order to help balance the game a little bit. But I'm just speculating on that part. So to summarize, don't bother insta mining in 1.18. It sucks now. It's just, unless you're trying to collect stone, it really isn't worth it. Branch mining in stone as well is not efficient at all. Even if you just go a little bit deeper into Deep Slate, you are going to get much higher rates. The most optimal is at y equals minus 58, at least according to my numbers. That does not factor in whether or not you're going to be mining through lava. It is a possibility as well, but that is where the most diamonds are going to be appearing, at least for regular branch mining. And sadly, it is not possible to mine as efficiently as the insta mining in 1.17. I suspect that it was changed probably because in, I believe, Bedrock Edition, you can't actually do insta mining, or at least you couldn't in the past. And it does borderline feel like an exploit depending on who you ask. So this does kind of rebalance how that all works. So that is likely the reason why they changed the distribution to go along with that. One thing that is kind of a final nail on the coffin, though, in terms of why it does kind of suck now, is if we look at how many diamonds are exposed to air versus ones that are not. So on this graph here, this top one represents how many diamonds are hidden. So they're not exposed to air, they're not exposed to water, they're buried. And by comparison, if we look all the way down to the bottom here, this flat line, that represents how many diamonds are actually exposed to air. So that's only around 1% of them. So if we're thinking, well, the caves are bigger, we're just going to find more diamonds naturally. No, that is definitely not the case. 99% of all the diamonds are still buried. So you definitely want to do some kind of branch mining in order to find the majority of the diamonds. And just to wrap up, a few of the assumptions that I've made in order for the math to work. One of the things that is generally required for statistics to make sense is to make things follow a normal distribution or a bell curve. So I'm assuming that diamond ore generates following that. And this is just to make sure that the error bounds make sense and that when I'm comparing different values that it also works out that way. I haven't found anything to lead me to believe that it doesn't do that. So if someone does disagree with me, let me know in the comments. And I am also assuming that diamond ore distribution is the same regardless of various factors, regardless if you are mining in a plus or negative direction in the Z or X axis, if it's a different world seed, or if you're in a different biome. And I do know that different biomes will sometimes have different ores, but that shouldn't impact the diamond rate specifically. So I'm assuming it's all the same regardless of which ones are there. So that pretty much wraps things up here. If there are any questions about this, please ask away in the comments, or if there's something that maybe I've missed or a point on this that we want to explore a bit more, just let me know. I'd be happy to try and look into it and hopefully make another video, some more contents around this. So thank you very much.